Horses know things that people do not know. This is not a mystical statement. It is an observational one, the kind that anyone who has spent enough time in close proximity to horses arrives at eventually. The kind that comes from years of watching animals who read the world through senses that human beings have largely traded away, in exchange for language and abstraction and the specific kind of intelligence that builds cities and writes laws and constructs the elaborate social architectures that produce as one of their byproducts the institution of slavery. Horses did not construct that institution. They were subject to it in their own way, owned and worked and valued and sold like the people who tended them, but they were subject to it without the specific human capability of understanding what they were subject to, which meant they were also free of the specific human burden of that understanding, the burden that the people who tended them carried every day, and that I carried for 23 years before the events of 1855 produced the outcome I am going to describe. What horses know, in the specific and non-mystical sense that I mean, is character. They read it more accurately and more immediately than any human being I have ever encountered, because they read it through the body rather than through the performed social behaviors that human beings use to present themselves to each other, and the body does not lie in the way that social behavior lies, and so the horses always knew, before I did, what kind of person they were dealing with, and their knowledge was available to me as information if I was paying the kind of attention that 23 years of working with horses had taught me to pay. My name is Jesse. I am 62 years old. I was born enslaved on a farm in Woodford County, Kentucky, in the year 1801, the son of a man named Cyrus who broke horses for a living, and who gave me, through the specific transmission of 20 years of his own accumulated understanding, the most comprehensive education in the behavior and management of horses that I have ever encountered in anyone, white or black, formally trained or otherwise. My father understood horses the way some people understand music, not as a learned skill but as a native language, a form of communication that was simply available to him in the way that the mother tongue is available to the person who grew up speaking it, naturally and without the effort that a second language requires. He passed this language to me not through explicit instruction, though there was instruction, but through the sustained immersion of my childhood in the specific world of horses, the world of the barn and the paddock and the training ring, and the early morning hours when the horses were fed and groomed, and the quality of each animal's well-being was assessed with the practiced attention of someone whose professional life depended on the accuracy of the assessment. By the time I was 12, I could read a horse's temperament in the first 10 seconds of a new encounter, before a single interaction had occurred, from the posture and the ears and the quality of attention the horse was directing at the world around it. By the time I was 18, I could take a green horse, a horse that had never been trained, and produce in it in 6 months a level of training that the best white trainers in Woodford County took a year to produce, through the specific method that my father had taught me, which was not the method of dominance and submission that most horse training of the period relied on, but the method of relationship, the building of a specific trust between the horse and the person working with it that produced, once the trust was established, a cooperation that no amount of dominance and submission could produce, because cooperation that comes from trust is different in kind from compliance that comes from fear, and the difference shows in the quality of the performance. This method was the foundation of everything I did at Glenmore, which was the horse breeding and racing operation in Harrison County, Kentucky, that I came to at age 32 in 1833, when I was sold from Woodford County to Gideon Warwick, who was building the most ambitious thoroughbred racing operation in central Kentucky, and who needed, for the management of that operation, someone who could do what the best horse trainers in the state could do, and who would cost him less than the best horse trainers in the state could be contracted for, which was the specific economic logic that had produced, throughout the history of thoroughbred racing in Kentucky, the most skilled horse management being done by enslaved people, while the credit for it was collected by the owners of the operations those people managed. Gideon Warwick understood what he had acquired when he acquired me. He understood it the way he understood everything about Glenmore's operation, which was in terms of value and productivity and the specific return on investment that each element of the operation produced. He did not understand it in any other terms, and he had not in 22 years shown any sign of developing the capacity to understand it in other terms, and I had spent 22 years being understood only in those terms, and had developed, in those 22 years, the specific, comprehensive understanding of Glenmore's operation and the Warwick family's situation, and the specific vulnerabilities of the racing enterprise that the 22 years had made available to someone paying the kind of attention I paid. In 1855, I used that understanding. Gideon Warwick was 61 years old in 1855 and had been building Glenmore for 30 years, which meant he had been building it longer than I had been part of it, and that what he had built before I arrived was the foundation that my 22 years of work had been building on top of. The foundation was sound. Gideon was not unintelligent, and he was not lazy, and the specific ambition that had driven him to build the most ambitious thoroughbred operation in central Kentucky was not an ambition that had arrived late, or that he had pursued half-heartedly. He had been working toward Glenmore's preeminence in Kentucky racing since the 1820s, and he had arrived by the time I came to the operation at a position that was significant, and that was, with the addition of what I brought to the horse management, capable of becoming the preeminent position he had always been working toward. Glenmore's horses were exceptional. Not from the beginning, not all of them, but the specific bloodlines that Gideon had been selecting and breeding for 30 years had produced, by the 1840s and 1850s, a roster of thoroughbreds that were among the best in Kentucky, which meant they were among the best in the country, because Kentucky in the 1850s was where the country's best thoroughbred racing was being done and being judged. The specific horse that this account is about was named Covenant. Covenant was a 5-year-old bay thoroughbred stallion in 1855 who was, in the assessment of everyone who had seen him run and everyone who had worked with him, the best horse in Harrison County and possibly in central Kentucky. A horse whose combination of breeding and physical capability and the specific quality of competitive drive that the best race horses have placed him in the category of horses that appear once in a generation, and that define the racing careers of the operations fortunate enough to breed them. I had been working with Covenant since he was a yearling. He was my horse, in the specific sense that the horse who has been trained and managed and understood by one person is that person's horse, regardless of whose name is on the title. The specific sense of a relationship built across 4 years of daily proximity, and the accumulated trust that daily proximity and consistent good treatment produce in a horse that has been treated with the same method my father taught me, which was the method of relationship rather than dominance. Covenant knew me. He responded to me in the way that horses respond to people they trust, which is completely and without the reservation that horses maintain with people they are complying with rather than cooperating with, and the difference between those two kinds of response was, in Covenant's case, the difference between a horse that produced the performance his physical capabilities pointed toward and a horse that produced something less, because the best performance of a thoroughbred of Covenant's quality requires the horse's complete engagement, and complete engagement in a horse of that intelligence and sensitivity requires trust rather than compliance. Covenant trusted me. He did not trust most other people. He tolerated the people he had to tolerate, and he responded to the people he was required to respond to with the specific controlled compliance of an intelligent animal that understands the situation it is in. But the trust he gave me was different from both of those things, and it was visible to anyone who watched him with me versus with anyone else. Gideon Warwick had noticed this. He had noticed it with the practical attention of a man who notices things that affect his investment, and he had responded to it with the practical response of a man who understands that the relationship between the horse and the trainer is an element of the horse's performance, and that disrupting the relationship disrupts the performance, which meant he had maintained my management of Covenant even in situations where his son's management preferences would have produced a different arrangement. His son's name was Lawrence. He was 28 in 1855 and was being prepared to inherit Glenmore, and was pursuing the preparation with the specific quality of a man who has always understood himself to be the future of something, and who has organized his entire sense of himself around that understanding, which is a form of identity that is fragile in the specific way that things are fragile
when they are constructed entirely around something external.
Lawrence was the element of the Warwick family's situation that I had been watching most carefully for the 5 years before 1855. Not because Lawrence was the worst person at Glenmore, which he was not in the specific sense of being actively cruel, but because Lawrence was the most dangerous person at Glenmore, the danger being the specific danger of someone whose identity requires the thing they are inheriting to be exactly what they have always been told it is, and who responds to any discrepancy between the thing as it is and the thing as they need it to be, with the specific aggression of someone whose sense of themselves is being threatened. Lawrence had threatened to sell me in January of 1855, not in response to anything I had done incorrectly, in response to the specific dynamic of Covenant's performance in my presence versus in his, a dynamic that Lawrence had been observing for 2 years with increasing frustration, and that had finally produced in a January conversation with his father that I was present for, in the way I was present for everything at Glenmore, the specific threat that I want to describe accurately. He said, "The horse performs differently with Jesse than with anyone else. We need a trainer that any competent rider can work with." Gideon had said, "The horse performs at his best with Jesse. We need the performance." Lawrence had said, "What we need is a horse that doesn't require a specific slave to perform. That's a vulnerability." He was right that it was a vulnerability. He was wrong about the correct response to it. And in being wrong about the correct response to it, he had given me the specific information I needed to understand what was coming and to prepare for it with the time I had available. I want to describe what I understood in the weeks after the January conversation, because the understanding is the account of what 22 years of paying complete attention to Glenmore's operations and the Warwick family's situation had produced in me. And the production is the most significant thing about what happened in 1855. I understood the racing calendar. The most significant race in Glenmore's season was the Harrison County Stakes in September, the race that was the primary occasion on which the operation's reputation was assessed by the community of Kentucky, thoroughbred breeders and owners who constituted the social and commercial world that Glenmore's standing depended on. Covenant was entered in the Harrison County Stakes, and his performance there was the most significant single event in Glenmore's 1855 season. I understood Covenant. I understood his physical capabilities and his psychological characteristics, and the specific training regime that produced his best performance, and the specific conditions that produced his worst. I understood what he needed from the person working with him, and what he would not accept from the person working with him, and the specific ways in which the relationship between a horse of his sensitivity and intelligence and the person managing him affected the quality of the performance he produced. I understood Lawrence. I understood that Lawrence had been interfering with my management of Covenant for the past year in specific ways that were producing in the horse the specific responses that interfere with what Covenant needed produced, the trust that was the foundation of his best performance. The interfering was not dramatic, and it was not malicious in any specific intentional sense. It was the interfering of someone who needed to establish his authority over everything in his father's operation, and who understood in the practical way he understood most things, that the horse's specific responsiveness to me and specific unresponsiveness to him was a fact about his own operation that he needed to change. The changing of it was producing, by the spring of 1855, a horse that was different from the horse I had been working with for 4 years, not dramatically different, not visibly different to anyone who had not been watching as closely as I had been watching, but different in the specific ways that the erosion of trust produces in a horse of Covenant's quality, the ways that showed in the quality of the training sessions and the quality of the morning gallops, and the specific quality of his attention and engagement when he was being worked. I understood the financial situation. Glenmore's 1855 season was more financially significant than any previous season because Gideon had made specific investments in the operation in anticipation of the season's results, investments that had been financed through arrangements that required the season's performance to justify them, and the Harrison County Stakes was the primary occasion on which the justification would or would not be produced. I understood all of this, and I held all of it in the same part of my understanding where I held everything I had accumulated across 22 years. The specific, comprehensive understanding of a person who has been paying complete attention to a complex situation for a very long time and who has arrived at the point where the situation requires a decision, at a position of knowing the situation more completely than anyone else who has a stake in its outcome. I made a decision in February of 1855, 6 months before the Harrison County Stakes, about what I was going to do with what I knew. The method I used in the 6 months between February and September of 1855 was the method my father had taught me applied to a purpose my father had not specifically taught me, which was the purpose of producing a specific outcome through the management of a horse's relationship with a specific person, rather than through any direct action on my part. I want to describe this carefully, because the careful description is the honest account of what I actually did, which was different from what someone might assume I did if they heard only the outline. I did not harm Covenant. I did not harm any horse at Glenmore. The horses were not instruments of my resistance in the sense of being used without regard for their well-being. They were the medium through which my resistance operated, but the medium was not harmed by the operation, and the operation was not conducted in any way that was contrary to the horse's interests. What I did was allow Lawrence's interfering to produce its natural consequences without the corrective management that my presence in the training process had previously provided to prevent those consequences from accumulating. When Lawrence inserted himself into the training sessions in the ways he had been inserting himself for a year, I stopped providing the specific counter-management that had been mitigating the effects of his insertions, stopped being the person who rebuilt, in the interactions after Lawrence's departure from the training ring, the trust that Lawrence's interactions had been eroding. The trust eroded, not completely, not in the way that a horse's trust in all humans erodes when a human being does specific harmful things to it. In the specific way that a horse's willingness to perform at its best erodes when the management of its training becomes inconsistent, when the signals it receives from one person are contradicted by the signals it receives from another person, and when the contradiction produces in the horse the specific uncertainty that uncertainty always produces, which is a withdrawal from full engagement into the more conservative engagement of an animal that is not sure what is being asked of it. Covenant's performance in training began to reflect this. Not dramatically, not in ways that the casual observer would identify as decline, but in ways that I could see clearly, and that I monitored with the same precision I brought to everything, tracking the specific indicators of his engagement and his willingness and the quality of his response to the specific demands of race training, and watching those indicators move in the direction that Lawrence's interfering and my managed non-correction was producing. I also worked with the other horses. Glenmore had 12 thoroughbreds in various stages of training and racing careers, and my management of those 12 horses was, in the 6 months of the preparation, conducted with the specific strategic attention of someone who understood that Covenant's performance at the Harrison County Stakes was the most significant single event, but that the full picture of Glenmore's season was the context in which that event would be assessed. The other 11 horses I managed with the full application of everything I knew, producing from each of them the best performance their capabilities and their current stage of training supported. I did this because the horses deserved it, and because my standards required it, and because the quality of my management of the 11 other horses was the most effective possible demonstration of the specific contrast I was building. The contrast between the quality that my full management produced and the quality that Lawrence's interference with my management of Covenant was producing. By June, the contrast was visible to Gideon Warwick. He was not the kind of man who missed things that were visible in the operation he had been managing for 30 years, and the specific divergence between Covenant's training trajectory and the training trajectories of the other horses in my management was visible to him from the quality of the morning gallops and the training sessions that he attended, with the regular attention of an owner who understood that his investment required his observation. He said nothing to me about it directly. He said things to Lawrence that I was present for in the way I was present for everything, and what he said to Lawrence was the specific language of a man who has observed something that concerns him, and who is directing the concern at the person whose choices he understands to be the cause of it. Lawrence responded with the specific response of someone whose identity is challenged by the implication of what is being said to them, which was to increase his involvement in Covenant's training rather than reduce it, because reducing it would have meant acknowledging that the involvement had been the problem. The increase produced the acceleration of the trajectory I had been watching. The summer of 1855 was the summer of the preparation and the waiting, and I want to describe both because the preparation and the waiting were different things, and both of them matter to the full account. The preparation was the active dimension of what I was doing, the specific daily management of 12 horses, and the specific managed non-correction of the dynamic that Lawrence's involvement with Covenant was producing, conducted with the precision and the patience of someone who understands exactly what they are building toward and who has the specific quality of professional discipline that allows the building to continue through the weeks and months that the building requires without the urgency that would disrupt it. I prepared Covenant for the race, not in the way I would have prepared him in a season unaffected by what I was managing, in the way that Covenant's actual current state of training and relationship required, which was a preparation calibrated to what he was in June of 1855 rather than what he would have been in June of 1855 if the previous 6 months had been different. He was still an exceptional horse. The erosion of the trust had not reduced his physical capability, which was the product of his breeding and his physical development and the 4 years of foundation training I had given him before the erosion began. What it had reduced was the quality of his engagement and his willingness, which affected the consistency of his performance rather than its ceiling, meaning that he was still capable of running at his best when the conditions were right, but that the consistency of those conditions was lower than it had been in the previous years. A horse that is capable of exceptional performance, but that does not consistently produce it, is a horse that the racing world assesses differently from a horse that consistently produces exceptional performance. The assessment matters because the racing world's assessment of a horse is the racing world's assessment of the operation that bred and trained the horse, and the operation's reputation in that world is the foundation of the commercial relationships that the operation depends on. I understood this, and I had been managing toward this understanding's implications all summer. The waiting was the interior dimension of what I was doing, the dimension that the preparation required me to sustain across the months between February and September without allowing it to show in anything that the people around me observed. I was good at waiting. I had been practicing it for 22 years in the specific way that people practice things they need completely and that they have no choice but to develop, which is through the sustained daily application of the capability, in circumstances that require it whether the person is prepared or not. I waited through the summer with the patience of someone who has made a decision and who understands that the decision's outcome depends on the patience more than on anything else, because the outcome I was building required time to become itself, and the disruption of the patience would have disrupted the building. I also, in the summer, made the additional preparation that the outcome required beyond the management of Covenant's training trajectory. I made it through the specific relationships I had built across 22 years with the other people who worked at Glenmore and in the racing community of Harrison County, relationships that had given me access to the specific information about the season's races and the specific assessments of Glenmore's horses by the other operations in the county that I needed in order to calibrate what I was doing with the accuracy it required. These relationships were not a formal network, and they were not organized toward any specific purpose other than the ordinary exchange of professional information that people in any field exchange with each other through the course of their daily work. What they had produced across 22 years was a comprehensive picture of the Harrison County racing community's assessment of Glenmore and its horses, and the specific expectations that the community brought to the 1855 season, expectations that I understood clearly and that I was managing toward with the same precision I managed everything else. By August, I had everything I needed to understand what the September race was going to produce. The Harrison County Stakes was held on the second Saturday of September in 1855, which was a clear, cool Kentucky autumn morning of the kind that the racing community preferred, the specific weather that produced in the horses the alert, engaged quality that the best performances required. These relationships were not a formal network and they were not organized toward any specific purpose, other than the ordinary exchange of professional information that people in any field exchange with each other through the course of their daily work. What they had produced across 22 years was a comprehensive picture of the Harrison County racing community's assessment of Glenmore and its horses, and the specific expectations that the community brought to the 1855 season, expectations that I understood clearly and that I was managing toward with the same precision I managed everything else. By August, I had everything I needed to understand what the September race was going to produce. The Harrison County Stakes was held on the second Saturday of September in 1855, which was a clear, cool Kentucky autumn morning of the kind that the racing community preferred, the specific weather that produced in the horses the alert, engaged quality that the best performances required. Covenant was entered as the favorite. His reputation from the previous season's performances and his breeding and the expectations that Glenmore's standing in the racing community produced had placed him at the center of the field's assessment, the horse that the community expected to define the race in the way that the best horse in a field defines it. I had prepared him for the race with everything I had available to prepare him with, which was not the same as what would have been available if the 6 months had been different, but was the best preparation the 6 months had produced and was, in the specific form of Covenant's actual condition on the morning of the race, a preparation that had produced a horse who was fit and healthy and physically ready for the race. He was also a horse whose willingness to engage completely with the race's demands was not what it would have been in a different 6 months. I knew this from the morning gallop on the Friday before the race, the final assessment of the horse's readiness that every trainer conducts in the 24 hours before a race, and the morning gallop told me what I had been watching the indicators move toward all summer, which was that Covenant on race day would produce a performance that was good and that would not be exceptional. A performance that was within the range of what a horse of his capability could produce in his current state of engagement, but that was not the specific transcendent performance that his best days had produced and that the racing community was expecting. He ran the race. He ran it well in the specific sense that he ran it as well as his current state allowed, which was with the fitness and the physical capability that the summer's preparation had maintained, and without the specific quality of complete engagement that the 4 years before the summer had produced. He finished third. Third in a field of 9 was not a disgraceful result for a horse of his quality. It was a result that the community could understand and accommodate in their assessment of the horse and the operation without the specific alarm that a worse result would have produced. It was also a result that was different from the expectation, and that the community noticed as different from the expectation, and that produced, in the community's assessment of Glenmore's current standing, the specific recalibration that a result that disappoints expectation always produces. The recalibration was not catastrophic. I had not been building toward catastrophe. I had been building toward the specific outcome that a horse of Covenant's established reputation, finishing third in a race he was expected to win, produced in the community's assessment of the operation that had produced the result, which was the specific uncertainty about the operation's current management that such a result produces when the operation has been building its standing on the expectation of a specific horse's consistent exceptional performance. Gideon Warwick received the result with the controlled composure of a man who has been building something for 30 years and who has just watched a significant element of that building produce a result that does not match what he expected, and the controlled composure contained, visibly to anyone who knew him as well as I knew him, the specific quality of a man doing his accounting in real time and arriving at conclusions he does not want to arrive at. The accounting pointed toward the same place that I had been pointing it toward all summer. The conversation happened on the Monday after the race, in the stable where I was managing the post-race care of the horses, which was where the conversation had to happen because the post-race care required my presence, and Gideon's conversation required his, and the intersection of those two requirements produced the conversation in the specific space where horses are managed and where, for 22 years, I had been doing the work that this conversation was now about. Gideon came to the stable on Monday morning, and he walked through the horses in the way he walked through them, when he was assessing rather than simply visiting, the specific walk of an owner who is looking at his investment with the questions of assessment rather than the questions of proprietorship. He looked at Covenant for a long time in the specific way of a man who is looking at something through the lens of Saturday's result. Then he looked at me. He said, "What happened with Covenant?" I said what I always said when Gideon asked me direct questions about the horses, which was the accurate assessment of the situation as I understood it from the position of the person who had been managing it most directly. I said that Covenant had been in a period of inconsistency in his training that had affected the quality of his engagement in the race, and that the inconsistency had been building across the course of the season. He said, "Why?" I said that the management of a horse of Covenant's sensitivity required consistency in the people working with him, and that the consistency had been disrupted in the course of the season. He was quiet for a moment. He was doing his accounting. He said, "By Lawrence." I said I was not in a position to make that assessment and that it was his assessment to make as the operations owner. He said, "I am making it." I said nothing. He looked at Covenant for another moment, and then he looked back at me and he said, "What would it take to produce the performance he is capable of at the spring stakes?" I said that would depend on the conditions of the preparation. He said, "What conditions?" I said that the horse needed the specific, consistent management that his training had been built on before the current season's disruptions, that the consistency needed to be complete and without the interruptions that the current season had produced, and that producing that consistency required the management of the training to be in the hands of the person the horse was trained to work with. He said, "You?" I said, "Yes." He said, "And Lawrence?" I said that the horse's training required the specific consistency I had described, and that the person managing it needed to be the person the horse trusted. He was quiet again. Longer this time. The accounting was more complicated on this question, and he was doing it with the thoroughness he brought to significant business decisions. He said, "What else do you need?" This was the question I had been preparing for since February, not the question I had been building toward in the sense of the question that resolved everything, because one question and one answer does not resolve 10 years of the specific situation I was in, or 22 years of the broader situation. But the question I had been building toward in the sense of the question that produced the conversation I needed to have, the conversation in which the specific leverage that the 6 months of preparation had produced was available to be used. I told him what I needed. I told him in the direct, specific language of someone stating the conditions of a professional arrangement, not as a demand and not as a threat, but as the accurate statement of what the situation required and what producing the best possible outcome for the Glenmore operation in the spring stakes required from the person who would be producing it. I needed my son freed. My son was 17 years old. His name was Marcus. He had been born at Glenmore 17 years earlier and had been working in the stables alongside me for the past 5 years, learning the work the way I had learned it from my father, through immersion and proximity and the sustained direct transmission of accumulated knowledge. He had my father's instinct for horses and my own methodical precision, and the specific combination of the two that my father had told me in the last conversation I had with him before he died in 1838 was the thing that the best horse people had, and that you could not teach but only recognize when it was present. Marcus had it, and Marcus was 17 and was going to spend the rest of his life the way I had spent the past 22 years if nothing changed, which was in the specific situation of someone whose capability was being extracted for the benefit of the operation that owned him and who had no formal standing in the relationship between that extraction and its compensation. I told Gideon I needed Marcus freed. I told him in the same voice I told him everything about the horses, the professional voice of accurate assessment and clear statement, and I told him that the spring stakes preparation I was being asked to provide required, as its condition, the freedom of my son. He did not say anything immediately. The accounting this time was the longest accounting I had watched him do in 22 years of watching him do his accounting, and I waited through it with the patience I had been practicing all summer and that I had been practicing for 22 years before that. He said, "And if I agree, Covenant is prepared at his best for the spring stakes." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you stay at Glenmore." I said, "Yes." He was quiet one more time, the shortest silence of the conversation, the silence of a man who has completed his accounting and arrived at his conclusion. He said, "Draw up the papers." Marcus was 17 years old when his freedom papers were signed in October of 1855. I want to describe what it was like to watch my son receive those papers, not because the description adds to the account of what I did and why, but because the account would be incomplete without it. Because what the 6 months of preparation and the September race and the Monday conversation were for was this, and the this deserves its own description. He received the papers in the Glenmore main house, in the study where Gideon Warwick managed the operation's legal affairs, in the presence of Gideon and his lawyer and me. He was 17, and he was built like my father, tall and broad with the specific physical quality of someone whose body had been developed by the specific work of managing large animals. And he stood in that study, and he received the papers with the composed attention of a young man who had been taught, by the same method my father had taught me, to pay complete attention to everything in his environment. He looked at the papers for a long time. Then he looked at me. I looked back at him with the specific look of a father who has done what the situation required and who is watching his son receive the result of the doing. I did not say anything. The look said what needed to be said. He nodded. The nod of someone who understands something they have not been told directly, but who has understood it from everything around the thing, from the context and the timing and the quality of the moment they are in. We walked out of the main house together into the October Kentucky morning, the specific quality of morning that Kentucky autumn produces, and we walked back toward the stables where the horses were and where the work continued. And neither of us said anything about what had just happened because neither of us needed to. Marcus has been free since October of 1855. He is 37 years old now, and he manages a horse training operation of his own in Bourbon County, which he established in 1865 after the war produced the conditions that made the establishing of such things possible for people in his situation, and the operation is known in Kentucky for the specific quality of the horses it produces, which is the quality of horses that have been trained by someone who understands them in the complete way that my father understood them, and that I understand them, and that Marcus understands them because it is the native language of our family, and it was passed to him the way it was passed to me, through immersion and proximity, and the sustained direct transmission of everything 3 generations of the specific knowledge of horses had accumulated. He named his operation Freeman Stables. I did not tell him to name it that. He named it himself, which was the most complete thing he could have said about what October of 1855 meant, and what he understood it to mean. I prepared Covenant for the spring stakes with everything I had. The commitment I had made to Gideon Warwick in the Monday conversation was a commitment I kept completely and without reservation, because the commitment was what the arrangement required, and because my standards required the work it described, regardless of everything else that was true about the situation. Lawrence's involvement in Covenant's training ended after the Monday conversation. Not announced, not publicly acknowledged, simply absent in the way that things that have been producing the wrong result are sometimes removed from a situation by the person who is doing the accounting. Lawrence continued to be present at Glenmore and continued to be the heir to its operations and continued to conduct himself in the ways he had always conducted himself, but the specific interference with Covenant's training that had been the instrument of the 6 months of preparation ceased, and the ceasing of it created the conditions for the restoration of the trust that the interference had been eroding. The restoration took time. Trust is not restored as quickly as it is eroded, which is the specific asymmetry of trust's economics in horses and in people, the asymmetry that makes its erosion a more powerful tool than its construction, and that makes the person who understands how to manage both its construction and its erosion more powerful than the person who understands only one. I managed the restoration with the same precision I managed the erosion, using every element of my father's method, the specific daily practices of relationship and consistency, and the patient accumulation of positive experiences that rebuild what has been disrupted. And I managed it across the winter months between October of 1855 and the spring of 1856 with the specific quality of attention that the restoration required. By March of 1856, 5 months after the October arrangement, and 6 months before the spring stakes, Covenant was the horse he had been before the erosion. Not the horse he would have been if the erosion had never happened, because you cannot fully recover from the specific history of something that has occurred and that has left its traces, but the horse he was capable of being in the current circumstances, which was a horse of exceptional capability, whose engagement with his work was complete, and whose trust in the person managing him was as solid as it had been in the best period of the 4 years before the erosion. The spring stakes were in September of 1856. Covenant won. He won by 2 lengths in a field of 11, running the race from the front in the specific way that a horse runs when it is running for itself rather than for the management of the person on its back, the way that distinguishes a horse that is competing from a horse that is performing. And the 2 lengths was comfortable enough that the people who watched the race understood they were watching a horse that had not been fully extended, and that the 2 lengths was the margin of a horse managing a race, rather than the margin of a horse being driven to its limit. The Harrison County racing community revised its assessment of Glenmore upward from the assessment that the previous September's result had produced. The revision was not dramatic because the community had not fully revised downward from the September result, and the spring result's upward revision was therefore a restoration of position rather than an advancement. But the restoration was complete, and the position that was restored was the position that 30 years of building and 22 years of my specific contribution to the building had produced. Gideon Warwick received the result with the satisfaction of a man whose accounting had resolved in the direction he had expected it to resolve when he made the arrangement, the satisfaction of a man whose decision had been validated by its outcome. I received it with the satisfaction of a man whose decision had also been validated by its outcome, which was a different satisfaction from Gideon's, because the decision that had been validated was a different decision, made for different reasons toward a different outcome, and the outcome was already 6 months old, and was living in Bourbon County learning the work that 3 generations of our family had made into its native language. I am 62 years old. I have been working with horses for more than 50 years, and I have been free for 7 years, freed by the same provision in a will that has freed several other people in the accounts of this series. The provision of a man who understood what he owed and who settled the debt in the only form available to him, which was the specific legal form of papers signed and witnessed and filed with the appropriate authorities. Gideon Warwick died in 1859. He was 65 years old, and he had spent 40 years building Glenmore, and the 4 years after our arrangement managing its continued operation with the specific knowledge of what the operation's best performance required, and the specific arrangements he had made to ensure those requirements were met. He died leaving the operation to Lawrence, which was always going to be the outcome, and which the arrangement I had made with him had not been designed to prevent, because preventing Lawrence's inheritance was not what the arrangement was for. The arrangement was for Marcus. Marcus was free before Gideon died, and the freedom was in the papers, and the papers were real, and the reality of them did not depend on Gideon's continued survival. Lawrence managed Glenmore after Gideon's death with the specific quality of management that Lawrence's capabilities and limitations produced, which was adequate management of an exceptional foundation, which is the specific kind of management that tends to produce adequate results from exceptional foundations. And Glenmore's standing in Kentucky thoroughbred racing in the years after Gideon's death reflected this. Covenant retired from racing in 1858 at age 8, which was the right age for a horse of his specific breeding and racing history, and became a breeding stallion at Glenmore, which was the purpose that his bloodlines most significantly supported, and the horses that descended from him in the years after his retirement were the specific horses that maintained Glenmore's reputation when the racing performances of the current generation were not producing what the racing community expected. I left Glenmore in the autumn of 1863, having been freed in the arrangement that produced Marcus's freedom and that I want to be honest about, which was an arrangement I made with Gideon in the Monday conversation after the September race of 1855, that freed Marcus immediately, and that freed me when Gideon died, which was in 1859, 4 years after the Monday conversation, and 4 years of continued work at Glenmore under the terms of the arrangement. I want to be clear about what those 4 years were. They were the years I agreed to when I made the arrangement, and they were years in which I did the work I had always done, with the same quality I had always brought to it. Because the work was what it was, regardless of everything else that was true about my situation, and because the quality of the work was what the horses deserved and what my standards required. I also want to be honest about what those 4 years cost, because the cost was real, and the accounting of this story is not complete without the cost, which is the specific cost of the 4 years between the arrangement and the freedom. 4 years in which I was not what the arrangement had been designed to make Marcus, which was free, and in which the freedom I was building toward was 4 years away, while the freedom I had secured for Marcus was already his to live in. I accepted the cost. I had accepted it when I made the arrangement, because the arrangement was the best arrangement available to the specific situation I was in, and the best arrangement available to any situation is the arrangement that produces the most significant outcome for the most significant thing at stake. And the most significant thing at stake in October of 1855 was not my freedom, but Marcus's. He was 17. He had my father's instinct and my precision, and the specific combination of the two that my father had told me was the thing you could not teach. He had everything ahead of him that the freedom I was arranging for him would allow him to reach. He needed the freedom more than I needed it, and more than the 4 years it cost me to secure it were worth to me relative to what they were worth to him. My father spent his entire life enslaved. He gave me everything he knew and he died before he was free, and the knowledge he gave me and the freedom that knowledge eventually produced were the specific inheritance that he passed through me to Marcus without knowing he was passing it, without knowing that the language he was giving me would eventually be used in the specific way I used it and would produce the specific outcome it produced. This is what horses taught me. They taught me that the relationship between the person who knows something completely and the thing that has been shaped by that knowing is a relationship that produces outcomes that neither force nor dominance can produce, that the trust built over years of consistent and respectful engagement is more powerful than any alternative available to the person who has it, that patience is not the same as passivity, but is the specific active practice of someone who understands exactly what they are building toward and who is building it with the care and the attention it requires. My father taught me horses. Horses taught me everything else. Marcus is free. His children will be free. Whatever they choose to do with their freedom, whether they choose the horses that 3 generations of our family have made into their native language, or whether they choose something else entirely, they will choose it freely in the complete sense of freely, and the choosing will be theirs. That is what the 6 months of preparation and the September race and the Monday conversation produced. That is what it was for. That is everything.
This is the story of Jesse, born enslaved in Woodford County, Kentucky in 1801, who served as the head trainer and horse manager at Glenmore Thoroughbred Operation in Harrison County, Kentucky from 1833 until his freedom in 1859. Harrison County records document the Warwick family and the Glenmore operation through the antebellum period. The specific role of enslaved horse trainers and stable managers in the Kentucky thoroughbred racing industry, and the comprehensive knowledge such roles produced, is extensively documented in the historical scholarship on thoroughbred racing and slavery in antebellum Kentucky. The specific use of that knowledge as an instrument of resistance and negotiation is consistent with the historical record of the forms that such resistance took in specialized enslaved labor contexts. Jesse Freeman appears in Harrison County records from 1859 onward as a free man. His son Marcus Freeman appears in Bourbon County records from 1855 onward as a free man and from 1865 onward as the operator of Freeman's stables. Jesse Freeman died in Harrison County, Kentucky in 1863 at age 62. His account, dictated to a transcriber in the months before his death, was preserved by the Harrison County Free Black community and donated to the Kentucky Historical Society in 1941, where it has been studied by historians of thoroughbred racing, slavery, and resistance as one of the most detailed first-person accounts of the use of specialized professional knowledge as an instrument of negotiation and liberation in the antebellum South. If Jesse's story moved you, if you believe that the most complete knowledge of a thing is also the most complete power over what that thing produces, that patience applied with precision across months and years builds what urgency cannot build, and that the freedom secured for a son is worth more than the years it costs a father to secure it. Subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Tell us what stayed with you most about Jesse's story. The horses that knew character before he did. The 6 months of preparation. The September race. The Monday conversation. Marcus receiving the papers in October. Freeman Stables in Bourbon County. What horses taught him about patience and trust. Subscribe, comment, share, and prepare for more voices that history tried to silence, but could not.